Welcome to Water Voices, our third installment, and an installment that helps us continue to preserve, protect, and restore our springs, rivers, and the aquifer. We are really, really happy to be here. A couple of housekeeping things. The restrooms are located right outside that door in the hallway. And we have a sign-up sheet. If you haven't signed in, please do so. We're not going to hound you, but we'd love to know how many people were here. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list to get notified about future events, we would love to have your John Hancock on the sign-up sheet. We're really happy today to announce some of our sponsors for this event. My name's Kathy Street. I'm with the Ichetucknee Alliance, and the Alliance is in place as an educational entity to help preserve, protect, and restore the Ichetucknee springs, rivers, and surrounding watershed. We have our Santa Fe River, who is a community citizen advocacy group. Their new president, Pam Smith, is at the back table. And their past president, Mary Malwitz-Gibson, is now their policy director, and as you know, somebody that can amass crowds in a heartbeat. I should have mentioned our venue and our host at the beginning. This is the High Springs New Century Women's Club. Jane Orr is their conservation chair. Jane, where are you? Yay. Say hi. All right. And we're very grateful to be able to use this great location every single time, so we appreciate that very much. And then surprisingly, we had another sponsor. We had Robin Frey and Briscoe Helms that are serious event planners who decided that this was a worthy enough endeavor to give us a generous donation for this activity as well, which is kind of cool to do. We're going to be talking about faith, water, and ethics. And as all of you know, sometimes ethics begs the question, well, whose ethics are we talking about? And for matters of the presentation tonight and the panelists that are so auspicious and have joined us, we're going to be talking about the ethics of preserving water, pure and simple. Let me introduce our panelists to you. Our moderator is Cynthia Barnett. Cynthia is an award-winning journalist who's written 3 books about water. She's written Mirage, Blue Revolution, and her current book, Rain. Cynthia also teaches about water ethics and has worked with different churches on water sustainability. Our other panelists. On the end, we have Robert Ulanowicz. Bob is a PhD and an ecosystem scientist who's a professor emeritus with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science and a courtesy professor with the University of Florida Department of Biology. Next to him, we have Jim McFarlane, a retired educator who served on the Florida annual conferences of the United Methodist Church's Creation Care Task Force and has been a presenter at the UMC Southeast Jurisdiction Caring for Creation Conference. And on the end, we have Lou Merritt, who is on the board of the Ichetucknee Alliance. Lou holds a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's degree in anthropology. So we have an auspicious panel. The way this is going to work is each of these panelists will be given a set amount of time to speak with you tonight, and we're definitely having time for Q&A, question and answers at the end. So welcome everybody, and please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be in High Springs. I'm surprised that I don't see any of my relatives in the audience. This is where my people are from, and so usually when I come to High Springs, I see someone, but I see lots of friends, so that's okay. Why am I on this panel when I am a journalist who writes about water? Surprisingly to me, 8 years ago, after my first book, Mirage, came out, the Diocese of Venice, Florida, asked me to come give a water talk from the pulpit. And I was just mortified. I was so nervous. I thought I would be struck by lightning for, hawking my books in front of a congregation. And really the point is that this has happened. It has happened that churches have reached out to me to learn about water and what they can do. This is a very powerful force in a lot of churches. They want to learn about water. They don't want to hear anything from me about the Bible. They want to hear about the water stress in their community and what they can do. And so I started those years ago. I spoke at the Diocese of Venice. It was a day-long summit that they had. It was absolutely fabulous. They had all these scientists from Southwest Florida, and they really wanted to learn deeply about what was going on with water in their community. And then they went on to devote a couple of years to water sustainability. Everything from educational programs to physically changing the grounds of their church there in Venice. So that happened. And then after my second book, Blue Revolution, came out, the National Council of Churches also, has a lot of interest in water from church members all over the country, and they wanted some way to talk to congregations about water. So they took Blue Revolution and created a biblical study guide, which is, again, that's nothing I ever could have done, but they were interested in that, and they did that so I could give them the water information, and then they translated it for their members. I went on, the Unitarian Church used the book for Justice Sunday. Justice issues are very important to many of our faith communities all over the country. So that's been another powerful inspiration to churches everywhere who want to be involved in water, particularly in Detroit. You may have seen some of the water as a human right issues, with the water being turned off in poor communities. So that's been another influence. And then locally, I just speak at churches when asked. And I have to say that the place I've spoken the most is Trinity United Methodist Church in Gainesville. This is a 4,000 member church, enormous church. They own 62 acres of beautiful property in North Gainesville, and it includes, is it 3 springs, Jim?
3 small springs.
There are 3 small springs on the property, and they are caretakers of these springs, and I just find that so beautiful and such a good model for what other churches may end up doing. So Jim will tell you more about that. But it's just neat to me that Trinity United has ended up being a model, and it was actually a neighbor of mine. A neighbor of mine needed someone to come do a water Bible study, and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't do that. And it worked out, and they're just very conscientious. So that's been a great experience. So I was going to start by, I actually want to start by talking a little bit. Darn it. Okay. Before we talk about Florida's water ethic and the U.S. water ethic, I think it's really important to put the global water picture into context. And this is also very important to any churches or faith communities that I've worked with. Many of you who've traveled in the third world or read some of this understand that our water problems are really incomparable to that feeling of having no clean, safe drinking water for your children or not having access to a toilet. I mean, this is really the huge global water issue worldwide. So still 1.2 billion people don't have access to clean drinking water, and 2.4 billion lack basic sanitation. So I've found that that's often where faith communities start their interest in water. It reminds me of the Rotary Club, too, because for years Rotary worked on water in the Third World. Now they work both on water in the Third World and water locally, and I think that's beginning to happen with a lot of churches. I spoke last week in Charleston, and I met the people who run Water Missions International. It's a great group, and these people they're Christian engineers who come together, who build water systems, many solar powered now, water systems and toilets all over the Third World. And it's just a fabulous organization. And I have their book, this really inspirational book that talks about the work they do. And then I brought a bunch of their annual reports. So if anyone is interested in this, I really like the idea, when we talk about faith communities, I like the idea, or even with kids, it's nice to be able to work on the problems of the world as we work on our local problems. And I think, again, I think this is a good way in with faith communities, because so many faith communities are already working on water in the Third World. Some of the NGOs who care about this stuff are working with Water Missions International and other Christian groups because they feel they've been effective. So I sort of wanted to start there. I was going to set the stage for our water problems, but I think this is a really educated audience on water, so I'm not sure that I should do that. So I'll just go through the slides very quickly. So the irony, the great irony, especially given that global picture that I just painted for you, the great irony both in Florida and nationwide is that we were blessed with so much water. We were blessed with so much compared with other continents, right? So in Florida, 54 inches of rainfall a year. Even nationally, 3.5 million miles of rivers, 60,000 trillion gallons of groundwater. It seems like an unimaginable amount of water, and it was a kind of luckier amount of water than other continents had, and we've really managed to squander and degrade it. So our degradation begins in the 19th century with swampland drainage. The state was half submerged. We set out to get rid of water, and we got rid of too much. The first mistake was draining swampland. So we've drained 11 million acres of swampland statewide. Now we know these as wetlands, and these really precious places for both holding our freshwater supply and keeping us safe from floods, giving the water a place to go when it rains too much, keeping out saltwater intrusion and all those other great things. In the 20th century, add overpumping of groundwater. So I'm so happy John Moran is in the audience. John, will you stand up and wave since I'm about to show? John and I are partners. We actually speak together all over the state about the idea of a Florida water ethic. And we really try to speak to business groups and other groups that are influential, and we sort of double team people. But I really feel that the pictures, in this case, speak louder than words. And we always show his very effective before and after shots from the Springs Eternal exhibit. So all of you know this story very well. White Springs in the heyday. White Springs becoming the first major spring in Florida to dry up due to overpumping. This one lets you see where peacock got its original name, and lets you see why William Bartram used that term blue ether of another world, right? And now John's after photo shows that blue ether is an algal brown soup. Some of you may have seen this. This was a time John and I had a really depressing assignment. we went to dedicate the first historic marker to a lost spring. So actually, this was the first spring to dry up. I misspoke about White Springs. Kissingen was the first major spring in Florida to dry up in the 1950s. So we walked through the dry spring bed with these elderly Floridians who had done cannonballs into the chilly water in their youth. And that the poignancy of being with those elderly people in a dry spring where they remember, their memories were so vivid. One woman told me she could still feel the chill bumps on her arms from when she used to jump into Kissingen as she stood there in the dry spring bed. And that is very powerful, the intergenerational ethic. And I think that is quite powerful too with people of faith. So I think anytime we can make connections to elders and children and the next generation, this is a very powerful way to talk about the idea of a water ethic. So the interesting thing about the overpumping in the 50s and 60s and early 70s drying up White Springs, is that it's part of what led to the really great awareness about water in Florida during the early 1970s. And I would say that's the last time that a really broad swath of Floridians became very interested in water. And I think of this group as the caring middle. Too often, people like Lou and myself and John, too often we are preaching to the choir. That's not who we need to reach. The people we need to reach are in the caring middle, and that's why faith communities are important. So in the early 70s, I would say that was the last time that the caring middle got really interested and engaged in water in Florida. So there was, Tampa Bay, if anyone knows what Tampa Bay was like then, and Biscayne Bay, just absolutely putrid, polluted. Tampa Bay so polluted it would tarnish silver in the mansions on the waterfront, drying up springs, drying up lakes. People got very upset. We created the water management districts. We started permitting groundwater pumping, and that was also a really important time nationwide. That was the time when ordinary Americans got really upset about water. They were upset about the great dam building in the West. We nearly dammed the Grand Canyon, and because Middle America got involved in that, got upset. There were mothers in pearl necklaces protesting the fires on the Cuyahoga River. It was a broader swath of people who were involved. I would say we haven't seen that since the early 70s. So we had the water management districts now. We got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We got the EPA. But now, 40 years later, I would say for the first time since then, the children growing up now in Florida and nationally are not inheriting waters as clean and abundant as when they were born. I think that's a very safe statement to make. And it's also true that fresh water has become the most degraded of all America's ecosystems. So there's all kinds of ways of measuring that, pollution and fish kills and so on. So we have the laws on the books. I love this picture that John took on the way home. You were on the way home from Howie in the Hills. And so this, I think, says it all. In that 40 years, we did a lot of good, but we've never overcome this idea of the illusion of abundance. Floridians really have an illusion of abundance, that you could live in a subdivision called Lakes and Springs and put out that much fertilizer and be pumping the groundwater in the middle of the day. That picture just says everything. It's such a great picture. But again, I think the caring middle, this large group in the caring middle, I think they don't know. And I think once people know, they do care. And so that's the idea behind the water ethic. Pollution too, I'm going to go through this fast. I just can't get back to that. So this is, Captiva, Southwest Florida, what Captiva is supposed to look like, what it looks like on the right when those polluted plumes are coming out Lake Okeechobee. But this is also a national issue. This is Lake Erie when they had that terrible algal bloom that shut down Toledo's water supply for 3 days. There are emerging pollution issues all over the country. It's not just here. There's a particular lot of cyanobacteria being seen by scientists, and part of it has to do with climate change. As waters warm, they're seeing more of these types of things. So when taken together, again, and this is the this is the Detroit story I mentioned that's been very important to faith communities. Just we think of the human right to water as a third world issue, but it's not. It's an issue here and in the developing world. And then I think this is a really important map. Shows the it shows the availability of groundwater over the past 50 years. This is a NASA satellite image that shows where groundwater is being depleted. And many people think of this as a California arid west issue, and as you can see, it's very red hot in Florida and other parts of the South. So all of this taken together, again, freshwater has become the single most degraded of all ecosystems, and yet when you saw that Lakes and Springs photo, those are people who don't understand what's going on underground, and I think faith communities are a really good way of meeting those people. The other thing I really want to stress is that this ethic should be thought of as all of us. It's not just agriculture or energy or whoever the bad guy is. It's flood control, it's energy, it's agricultural irrigation, and it's the rest of us. So the water ethic is the framework that I've used to talk to people about water, to talk to people in the caring middle. And as Kathy said, some people try to say, what's your definition of water ethics is different than my definition. And I'm not so sure I buy that, because I think we can all agree that in this definition, there are definitions we can come up with that a whole room full of people could agree on. And I think this is a good one, sort of the definition of sustainability, making sure the way we live with water today doesn't jeopardize fresh, clean water for our children, businesses, and ecosystems tomorrow. The other definition that Kathy mentioned is this simple ideas, using less and polluting less. Really, it's coming together to use less and pollute less. And these are things we can talk about to churches. But I do think it's important not to foist ourselves on churches. I mentioned that Jim's church has asked me, every time I've ever spoken in a faith community, it's because they asked me. I haven't foisted myself on anyone, and I think that's important too. There's a great interest in water among communities of faith, and it's a matter of making ourselves available to people who are interested. So the water ethic derives from Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go straight to the new champions for water. And I'm sorry Sister Pat isn't here tonight. Sister Pat couldn't be with us. She was going to talk about the encyclical, but some of the other panelists will talk about this. And all the places I traveled for Blue Revolution to write about water ethics in other communities, churches were involved in bringing the information to the public. So in San Antonio, there was a Catholic college that also is caretaker of a spring where the sisters were involved in the water ethic. And it really, the players now have to change. Again, for the past 40 years, we've tried to rely on water managers and water laws and water lawyers and water engineers, and we see that now water needs the rest of us. So it's not just communities of faith. I think it's also, high-tech business people, universities, and other leaders. But churches are an important leader in their communities, and I think it's a big part of the caring middle. This is a church in Southwest Florida, and I have more wonky things that I can provide you at a different time, but I have a handout bringing the water ethic to your place of worship. There's all kinds of things you can do, from rainwater catchment to stormwater plans. This is a church in Southwest Florida that totally dug up all of its sod and planted a rain garden to show the congregation how they could be involved in their individual land on keeping runoff from going into Naples Bay. So these are really, doesn't have to be intangible, it can be really tangible and hands-on. So I can send you any of that, and then I have an adult education and resource and study guide, a biblical guide to Blue Revolution. And I'm going to hand it now. Lou, should I hand it now to Jim or Bob?
To Bob.
Okay. Thank you. I hope I wasn't too wordy.
Thank
but
you.
I am a word person, so.
Thank you. Well, I too am very sorry that Sister Pat isn't here, because I have the unfortunate duty of trying to emulate her charisma. And those of you who've seen her in person or on the network, so that's a tall order that I certainly can't live up to, and so forth. So what I'm going to do for the most part is just show you her slides, read a few of them, and comment and whatnot. But before I do that, oh no, that's the wrong one. Yeah, the other one. No, that one. That's it. Okay. But before I do that, I want to interject a few. Great. I want to interject a few comments of my own about Laudatio Si and so forth, mainly because I don't think that the real essence of the encyclical has really reached the public. I mean, you read about it and you hear, well, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, believes in climate change, and that's a big political issue. Well, I felt that's very kind of arbitrary. I mean, they could have just as well said he doesn't like air conditioning, which he disparages which might interest some of you. Very arbitrary. Some people went a little bit deeper and talked about his integral ecology, the idea that everything is truly interconnected, that ecosystems, economics, social, political, it's all one mix. And you can't jiggle it one place and not see a result somewhere else. But I think there's something even deeper. But in order to see that, you've got to know a little bit about the context of it all. So I want to say just a few words about Roman law, because the encyclicals essentially are edicts of Roman law. Now, as most of you know, the Christian Church is the oldest administrative body in all of the world in continuous existence. And they started, when Rome, the law of Rome was the law of the land. And the church, although it's changed in many ways, still, at least the Catholic Church, still goes according to Roman law. Now, how is Roman law different from what we know? What we know for the most part is English law, the idea that there's a certain minimum, and if you fall below that minimum, bam, you get punished, you get whacked and whatnot. That wasn't the case with Roman law. The Romans tried to create a community of virtue, okay, whereby they passed laws that told how a virtuous person is to behave, okay? And they knew full well that not everybody could live up to the high standard. Many would falter. And if you were brought into court or into question about a particular law, you were judged according to whether you had the capability of living up to that virtue or not. Okay, now, as you can see, that doesn't translate very well into a democratic society. There's a lot of room for abuse in all of that. But if you're a church, and if the ultimate judge and jury is God, well, why not? In any event, you have to look at the encyclical as an edict of Roman law. Now, why is that important? Because what he's saying in Laudato Si, I say it's sort of like Francis the Bishop of Rome is channeling Francis the Saint of Assisi. Okay? He's really putting forth the Franciscan way of life. Now, those of you know a little bit about Francis of Assisi. He created an order, actually 3 orders, of monks and nuns. And they were mendicants, which meant that they went around begging. And poverty was a big thing. The idea was that poverty actually enriches spirituality so that less is better. I mean, can you think of anything more diametrically opposed to our particular ethos of today? But it's in there, and it's not difficult to find. He essentially talks about how the economy must serve human dignity and essential needs, and it's not an end in itself. This sounds new to us now, but really in the church it wasn't. Back in 1891, Novarum Rerum, Leo XIII talked about pretty much the same thing. So the people now who are talking about, oh, the Pope is communist or something like that, they probably don't know what communism is, number one. And number two, this is nothing really new within the church. The church has never put the stamp of approval on unmitigated, unfettered capitalism. So he's setting a very high bar. Very hard for us to achieve. We don't really know how to get there. Mary Odom's father, after whom the Springs Institute is named, as Howard T. Odom, and his wife Elizabeth talked about the prosperous way down. Okay, so this is all very radical. We don't know how to get there, but he's at least setting for us the direction. So let's go to the sister's slides. He talks about first of all, the emphasis now is on relationships rather than laws and formula and so forth. He talks about the violence, and he could also say the greed in our hearts is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evident in the soil, the water, air, and all forms of life. So that earth itself is among the most abandoned and threatened of our poor. There's always in the Christian church the prerogative of the poor. We've forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth, our very bodies are. We breathe her air, receive life and refreshment from her waters. Now, water plays a big part in Laudatio Si. This morning I went and counted, it's mentioned 47 times in the document. An entire section, section 3, is devoted to water. And I'll just read you a few excerpts that Sister pulled out. Even as the quality of available water is constantly diminishing, in some places there's a growing tendency, despite its scarcity, to privatize the resource, turn it into a commodity subject to the laws of the market. To privatize when a public trust, because water, as we will see, is a public trust. And he warns, an acute water shortage may occur within a few decades unless urgent is action taken. The environmental repercussions could affect billions of people, and it's conceivable that the control of water by large multinational businesses may become a major source of conflict in this century. The big message he's flashing here is, it's a public trust, keep it public. Okay. This is my favorite, actually. It's a little bit long, but I'll read it all. In any discussion about a proposed venture, a number of questions need to be asked in order to discern whether or not it will contribute to genuine integral development. For example, what will it accomplish? Why? Where? When? How? For whom? What are the risks? What are the costs? Who will pay for these costs and how? This is very different from the way we do things now. If you want to put up a shopping center out here, you've got the prerogative. Okay, you don't have to show that the community needs a shopping center. Okay, continue that because it gets even better. In this discernment, some questions must have a higher priority. For example, we know that water is scarce and indispensable resource and a fundamental right which conditions the exercise of other human rights. In red, This indisputable fact overrides any other assessment of environmental impact on a region. You want water voices? There's a water voice. Okay? Sources of water are necessary for healthcare, agricultural, and industry. But now in many places, demand exceeds sustainable supply with dramatic consequences in the short and long term. That's why we're here today. This applies to Florida. Cynthia mentioned earlier about the poor and their access to the water. It is horrific in many places. Okay, and then we go into things, she goes into things that are more Florida-oriented, and she talks about the golden age of Florida politics when Ruben Askew in the early 70s were here. And he said Governor Askew and the legislature tried to set up water management districts to set minimum flow levels, MFLs, and to protect surface water and aquifers. Unfortunately, this was a preventative, precautionary action that was not adopted. So the first wrong turn is in 1972, the law failed to include public trust language. Very important if you're going to control water is that it be declared a public trust, so that it really hampered the water management district's ability to act. The water management districts failed to implement the 72 mandate, although Putnam County, our neighbor over here to the east, brought a suit to force implementation of the MFLs in 1994, which didn't go through. So that now what we have essentially is that we have minimum flow levels that are not being enforced. If things fall below that, they go into what's the status?
Well, there's recovery.
Recovery. They go into recovery, and certain things are urged and whatnot, but there's no real teeth in this particular law, unfortunately. She talks about the United Nations in declaring water as a human right, that Mother Earth, of which all beings are composed, have the following rights: the right to life and to exist, and the right to be respected. That's the rights. The obligations of humans are that every human is responsible for respecting Mother Earth. And she ends up on some of her plans. This December, she and two other attorneys are going to be going to Paris on a third International People's Tribunal on the rights of nature to essentially draft documents and draft putative international legislation on behalf of environment and water. And going to be designing a model for a future International Court of Environmental Issues. We don't have time for questions now, but if you look at earthjurist.org, all of this is explained in much further detail. Shall I just segue into the next one? Or okay, if you could. Now I want to talk quickly about an initiative that I was part of before I moved. We retired, my wife and I, Marika and I, moved here in 2008, and just before that, 2 years, our pastor contacted me and says, look, you're in the environmental scene and so forth. I want you to go out and develop a plan for our parish so that we can do things right, so that we can go green. What you really need are people like Jim here and so forth in your parish to spearhead all of this, or preferably, your pastor itself. And we came up with this called Study and Recommendations, whereby our parish can act with greater respect and love for God's gift of nature. And I'm just going to read a few. I can't read you the whole preamble. The idea is to establish this link between the environment and the religious expression. We parishioners express our fervent concern over the quality of life of our neighbors, including generations to come. And as a community of worship, we want to show religious respect for the integrity of creation. We therefore seek to include a proper reverence for God's creation into our prayer lives and worship. Constantly, we're aware that God is ever ready to sacrifice for our welfare. This is called kenosis. In other words, God pulling back and withdrawing, sacrifice for our welfare. And we intend to transform our own activities. The implication here is we are going to be kenotic and draw back too. Buildings and grounds in whatever way possible so as to minimize our impact on resources. in order that they can be shared with others and preserved for those to come. We pray that by molding our lives and our families in the image of St. Francis of Assisi, this was 9 years ago, before when Jorge Bergoglio was still Jorge and not Francis, Bishop of Rome, okay? We may give abundant witness to others of how to harmonize faith with a way of living that treads gently upon God's green firmament. Okay, how to do this? Well, first of all, we advertised in the bulletin and so forth for a committee, whoever was interested. Then the committee met, and we had to come up with an overall schema of how we wanted to approach it. We then interviewed, we had about 6 months of interviews with every group in our parish, asking them what they thought they could do in order to make our parish actively more green. The members then write up the results of the interviews, and we coalesce, prioritize, and edit it into a report, which I'll talk about quickly later. And we promulgated the report, and then finally we implemented priority actions, and I'll tell you how we did with that. But I want to quickly go through the schema. Wrong one. Okay, we essentially identified 3 areas: activities as a parish, our property and land. You're going to hear soon about a 62-acre property. Ours is 110, mostly woodland and so forth. So we really had a responsibility to manage this land in the right way. And then the buildings, how we could work with them. I'll go very, very quickly through and just notice a few things here and there. As far as activities goes, the first subcategory was education. We first of all targeted youth and adult education programs. We wanted to create a nature trail. We wanted to promulgate green tips all around the parish. We wanted the committee members to be available to talk at parish events and outside the parish. We actually went out and created some Go Green bags. It says, St. John Vianney Catholic Church goes green, stewards of God's earth. And the idea is that we could carry these to the shopping center, and everybody would see that A, we went to St. John Vianney, but B, St. John Vianney was concerned about our environment. A little gimmick, but hey, it worked. Okay, liturgy. We wanted to plan an Earth Day Mass, and masses on feast days of particular environmental saints. We wanted to maintain, the parish vehicles in good order, cut back on unnecessary travel, encourage busing and carpooling. Now, land and stewardship. We adopted a best forestry management plan. We planted native and low maintenance species. This is getting to sound a lot from what you read in the paper here in Florida now. We wanted to find and ameliorate erosion on campus, plant for shading and wind protection. Here's convey some property to conservation groups. That's a real hard trick if you're in the Catholic Church, let me tell you. But we'll talk about that too, quickly. As far as maintenance of land, and here's where we get close to the water now, we minimize fertilizer and pesticide applications, use gray water, provide rain barrels for water capture, as you just mentioned, pursue Baywise certification, here it's called Florida Friendly, okay? Adopt compost and mulching, create wildfire habitat, brush piles, birdhouses, etc. Whoops. Okay, we go to buildings. We had all of our buildings have an energy audit. We upgraded the ease of recycling. We eliminated styrofoam completely from all parish activities, because that's the real problem in solid waste management. Placed all our hot water tanks with inline heaters, and required green plans for all future buildings. We were worried about hazmats, that they stored properly, made an asbestos inventory, and inspect transformers for leaks. Okay, implementation. We prioritized all of these and promulgated the top ones. We drew up a budget, okay, which the parish council actually approved of $18,000 for the first year. And then we advertised it to the parish and to the community at large. And we put the plan online. Okay, that was all 9 years ago. Now, what is the status of our efforts? I would invite you to go and actually read them for yourself. Father Peter Daly, who is our pastor, is a national columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, and he reported all about this in a recent edition, I think it was April of this year. If you Google St. John Vianney Go Green, you'll find it, and so to summarize it for you here. Our successes. We did perform most of the audits. We did upgrade our recycling. We transferred 16 acres of archdiocese property to a conservation group. Now that's a miracle in and of itself, let me tell you. We planted native species. We're using goats for weed control. We cut way back on watering, fertilizing, and pesticides to the hue and cry of some parishioners. We sold 2,000 shopping bags and banished styrofoam. Some of the things we didn't get done, we really didn't implement the liturgies. There's been little change in our educational program. And Father Daly says, well, we're batting 500. We've still got a way to go, but hey, this is Roman law, eh? We experienced resistance back in Maryland when Father Daly took this nice plan and gave it up to the bishop, the archbishop, and they were appalled. You know, this was 9 years ago, mind you. Okay, they didn't know which way the wind was blowing yet, and there were no bravos. Okay, this was something foreign, pagan, and whatnot. Parishioners objected. They want Masters golf tournament quality lawns, and we cut way back on watering and fertilizing and so forth. So there was a lot of pushback there. I've tried to do this here in Florida amongst the Catholic community, and I've had very, very marginal success. We advertise for student interest in this. I mean, there are 10,000 students, Catholic students, on the campus approximately, of whom about 1,500 to 2,000 attend Mass every week, and they were exposed to all of this and asked to come in, and we could formulate this for our parish. And out of the 10,000, one student responded. You know, this to me was, it was horrible. And there's been clerical indifference as well. You know, I mentioned this to a particular priest who says, we're an urban parish. We don't have need for all of this. You know, I was so flabbergasted I couldn't even argue back and so forth. So that there is pushback on many. But you're going to hear more, I think, hopefully hear about successes in other areas. Let me just first of all say that the report is available online at this particular address. I've made 5 copies of our plan so you can read it in all of its gory detail, and they'll be here if any of you want to take it home. I ask you to share it, and if you can't share it or don't get a chance, please copy this down and download it for your own work. And hopefully I've stayed within the time.
All right, got to see how much cord I've got here. Oh, I can go pretty far. I do get kind of moving around a little bit. So, boy, I hear what I'm going to tell you, and I don't know if it's what you really want to hear or not. But the first thing that does come to my mind right now is a psalm with Abrahamic faiths. You know, there's a bunch of them with the Catholics, the Jewish, the Protestants, the Muslims. If you're familiar with that psalm, you know something about what's said in it. And I've got to say that it really struck me this Sunday is Trinity's success didn't start with anything I did. In fact, it was all done before me. It's grown from within the church, a feeling, and it really came down to that psalm. The Lord leads us some places. And that water, that still water, is something that is very important for each and every one of us. Now, I hear that here with this group today, but you know, it goes farther than that. You haven't had the experience I have of being in January in New York City. And, I think, what have they done to the rivers? The Hudson River is the cleanest it's been in 100 years. Water is important to them, as important as it is to us. Can we live without water? You should stomp your feet and say, no. And it needs to be clean water. But is each and every one of us doing something yourself to protect the water around you and around this country and around this world. And that's probably the biggest thing of, the various committees, the meetings, all over the place that I've been. Yeah, DP is going to take care of that. We have a water management district taking care of it over here. Why aren't they doing it? We can go and complain at the county commission meeting, the state legislature, but what are we doing ourselves? And, within the task force I've been on, that's, again, what are we doing? Well, we need to do this, we need to do this. Oh, we need to take one stand maybe and do something every day. So Trinity, let's get back to that. I was asked to be the Protestant or the Protestant in here because we protest a lot. So yeah, Trinity goes back, and they were not always on this great, big, beautiful campus. They had a smaller campus. That when I grew up in Gainesville, driving out 8th Avenue, it was a big, beautiful campus with trees all around. It's all houses now. I'd ride my bike out past it towards 300 Club and, hit the water and see a couple sinkholes and trees. And, it's all developed now. And it was too small a piece of property for this church. So fortunately, going back, I think it's 15 years, I was not there because I grew up in Gainesville, and I left Gainesville. I was down by Wikiwashi, and I've done this stuff all over the states. But I'm right now back in Gainesville. And Trinity was the church that I turned to as I come back to Gainesville, saying, yep, okay, which Methodist church, this one over here, that one. And, one of the things is walking on a campus and just feeling something about the calmness of it. Realizing that, and then realizing again this Sunday as it's brought out, and some thoughts about, okay, what do we say for certain? We say that the church was designed by a group of people that had property. The property was a large piece of property. The property actually has a wonderful 1/3 of it with a creek running through it, with 3 little springs coming out of the hill on the side, a nice little ravine. You got to protect it, right? You got to think about your church. Well, how many churches are fortunate enough to have the head of the Department of Landscape Architecture, University of Florida, that's on the church membership? And I knew Herrick Smith for many, many years because my dad taught with him way back when I was a little kid. We sat in the backyard, and that was the gathering part for everything. So I bring you back to what do we do and why. It was sitting under the oak tree in my backyard, 2 blocks from Gainesville High School, with a 5-acre lake in the back. It comes right up to the edge of our property line. I didn't live on it, but some other people did. And I got exposed to water and realized we're on the highest spot around here. We got a beautiful lake. I was swimming in it down into where the springs were feeding out, more of a, a sand filtered one, not some of the beautiful 5th magnitude springs. There was a sinkhole in 2 places on it where it's running out, and then all those creeks in Gainesville. So I grew up loving this and hearing the caring for creation, just as everybody within that church really did here. And Trinity's success is because they designed it around the environment they had. There were the green pastures. There were horses out there. There were 2 sinkholes. The church is going to go on this, protect the ravine area, protect the water. What could they do except put a lot of windows at the back of the church? When you go in, if you haven't looked out, the windows are looking out over the calm waters and the green pastures. And it is instilled within the church from way before I stepped foot with this group, even though I've had contact with them way back. So in the past 3 years, this is all established. We talked about caring for creation and more committees and more stuff. We haven't had a lot of committees, but every once in a while, we get a group of people together to discuss an idea to take to our board of directors. Like there's a landscaper in the area that wanted to help by making a nice path going around the wetland area, 3-mile path that's just being finished up now, encouraging everyone to come hike along the edge of the wetland area, get your hike in on the property. It's open to everybody. We want you to enjoy it. J.D. Nolan's memorial walk goes along the ravine with a little bridge over the ravine. Along that, and we're talking 10, 15 years ago, identifications for plants are already there, little identifiers. So you see, there's something in the church that's thinking about caring for it. So I can't take all the credit, but it is awesome when it happens, when you've designed the flow of the water off of it into retention areas that are then seeping back in to recharge the area. All of this is critical, and I know that's far-fetched because there's many churches I walk into with 500 people. That's a big one. 25 people, it's a small one. And what can you do with 25 people? Maybe you're in a church that was established in 1890 in the same building and you're meeting there. You can't really change that building so much, can you? But what can you do? You can look around it. You can look at the green areas. Where's the water running off? Instead of everything running off of a parking lot into the creek and going, you can think about creating a wetland area. So that's taking you kind of through some little thoughts, but let me go bigger. Where did I get into all this and why did I do it? Environmental educator, but firmly believing in creation and not really being able to say that as I taught in public school much. This is God's creation and creation care and adding that into a speaking presentation. But I did grow up with the Bible in my hand from the beginning. And as I look back in it, I see so much about water. The blessed waters flowing from the property at Trinity are affecting the community all the way through Gainesville until it decides to sink into a sinkhole, into the aquifer, and then go all the way on, and it'll end up out in the Gulf. So caring for creation was important. The task force opened up, and I was concerned a lot with the water quality in the state of Florida, believe it or not. Why would I worry about that? I grew up in Gainesville. I have lots of water coming up from the ground. Glen Springs was fun to swim in. But the biggest thing's built to what do we do as an overall group? So I got started with the Caring for Creation Task Force. And I was only with that for the state of Florida's United Methodist Church. You know, they kind of got structure. They don't really get dictated from the top down, but there's a little bit of structure. And as a state committee, we started looking, what are we going to do? How do we encourage our churches to participate in caring for creation? Great, it's all listed out there. All the things that, particularly when you sit in a committee, you start looking at and saying, let's do this, 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 and this. There's checklists. A lot of that was done at Trinity. But all of our churches in the state weren't really catching on. So what did we do real quick as a state task force? We took the annual conference and a resolution was created making an award, a competition, so to speak, through all of the Methodist churches in the state of Florida. So if you're a Methodist out here in your church, you know, you should be doing something, nice criteria, check off the points that you got, and you get an award at the annual conference. So it's recognition. Of course, that brings up the discussion and the topics. But I tell you, I had it lucky. It wasn't so much my idea and all that fun, but we had a bishop in the state of Florida that was on the Council of Bishops for the world for the Methodist Church. And it was another year later of my joining in with this that the Council of Bishops came out with their letter. Mm-hmm. A call for hope and action. And a good portion of that is caring for creation. The other portion is peace. The caring for creation lined out so much that our church, our religion, Abrahamic faith say, in caring for the waters that you've got, and making sure that it's sustainable and it's going on and useful, and we're not destroying it. And many people, probably everyone in here, every time you turn around and you hear something else about our springs. Another coast is covered with this toxic green algae. There is hope. Every once in a while I give up and say, oh, we can't ever recover from this. But I did live through Tampa Bay, swimming in it in the 60s, not wanting to touch the water and seeing the dead things floating, and then being able to swim in it in the past 5-10 years. I'm happy. The restoration in Tampa Bay is tremendous. So there's hope, right? My trip to New York says, yeah, there's hope. New York. What did I expect to see from Florida other than I've been told all my life, this is how we do it in New York. Sorry, that doesn't offend anybody, but what I saw them doing in New York was incredible because Harlem Park is one that's won several international awards if you haven't ever seen anything about it. Green waterfronts. What do they do with their water? They got a sewer treatment plant. What do you do with it? Do you dump it in the Hudson River? Do you pump it out there and kill everything offshore so you don't have any shrimp or lobster? Why don't we take some of these piers and build a green area out there? recycling the water, letting the grasses absorb the nitrogen. So they have piers, these big, monstrous piers. Pier 40, if you've ever been to New York, has a greenway. There's a road over there. There's about 6 lanes of road, 3 lanes of bicycle path, walking path, trees and grass all through this stuff. Pier 40 has this whole thing covered with grass, a soccer field out there. So they've looked at what they're doing with their water different than just dumping it in the ocean. They're restoring their oysters, just like Chesapeake Bay restored oysters. So all these things have come together and kept me pretty busy. I have traveled since the Gulf oil spill then popped up after all this was going, about every county all the way across. And everything everywhere is the Gulf's horrible. But all of our restoration plans, all the lead people that y'all want to turn to, what are you doing? They've come to realize that the importance lies here, in the waters that are starting down to the Gulf or to the Atlantic. We are so responsible for the nitrate level that each of our churches needs to be doing something, each person needs to be doing something, the world needs to do something, but let's start off like this. I'm lucky. I'm sitting in that beautiful lake, feeds out 3 water charge areas, 3 different water management districts. You know, so I've got to be real careful. I'm going to mess up the whole state if I do anything wrong. Just as you need to look at what you're doing. But we came back with our council, task force, and now we've given awards. What are we going to do? You know, people are just like all over the place they're switching their lights on and off. They're getting motion sensors on the lights. They're changing the lights out in all these sanctuaries to LEDs. You know, every point they can get. You know, somebody's donating the money for this one. Just like that trail, total donation. It's not the church paying for it. Our monies are going more to missions. But within the congregation, there's other people doing things to make it greener, to make it better at the church as well as the house. So we as a task force came up about, well, the works on it was 2 years ago and about a year ago. Then we've got the conference, annual conference for the state. And the resolution was created, which I pushed really hard on some good wording on it, but for each congregation, the United Methodist Church, throughout the state of Florida, to adopt their watershed. Your church should adopt your watershed. You individually should adopt your watershed. How big is it? Well, Trinity's cool. Yeah, it flows off, and it becomes a watershed that's real obvious right there, flowing through Gainesville. Mine is really obvious because I already know I'm on a recharge area where the springs and everything flowing out 3 different ways across the state continue. So what do you do? If you wait for your committees, it might be too late. What you do as an individual might be looking at what's available to you, whether it's the Catholics, whether it's another group, whether it's an organization called Sunshine Power and Light, Sunshine State Power and Light. There's an interfaith group for caring for creation. If you're not familiar with them within your congregation, look to them, get some leadership. It's on the internet. You can look up Interfaith Power and Light, Florida Interfaith Power and Light. I know a lot of the people there, a lot of other people that founded it. But that's a starting spot. Go meet with them, see what they're doing. If they're having a get-together like this about water, show up. Go back, report to your church what's going on. Lake Junaluska is a southeastern regional headquarters, so to speak. But now they've moved to an office building in the city, but that's still like a sanctuary area, summer camp area, leadership training area. And we have an annual conference there, which I spoke at several times, mostly about Gulf restoration and the problems everybody's having through Mississippi and everything with the water. Those type meetings are open to any faith, anybody. That's in March of every year. And I would love to see you show up there and say, hey, look at this idea. We've got workshops all day long. One of them might be a workshop about the rain bucket thing. Go home with your rain bucket, or a gardening type of idea that comes to mind. I know Martha Pierce does the gardening thing quite often. 10, 15 different workshops going on, repeating, they've got the space to be able to do it. So it's a great way to get some exposure, meet some other support people for your topic, your idea. That will help before getting the committee, and a lot of times it's, You don't necessarily need a committee. If you got 4 of you that say this is a good idea, look at your church structure, and maybe you can go to your leader of the parish, maybe a council that you have, and say, we've got this idea. The hiking trail around Trinity, that's now going to be a beautiful thing, was a group, one individual going to meet with the pastor, and then we had a committee of 5 that sat down, talked about different ideas, shared the videos, plotted it out, and said, here's a cool way to do it. And our council then voted for it and decided, okay, you can do it. So it's underway. So things like that can happen. How am I doing on time? Have I talked enough?
I think so.
Okay. I asked because, last time everybody's looking like that. Your eyes are on me, so that's good. I can see them kind of. Last class at University of Florida was supposed to be over like 8:30. And at 9:15, I finally found the clock back there and noticed, ooh, nobody's left yet. So nobody's left. I'm glad you're here. But I'll quit for now, and if you have some questions, maybe we can go from there.
Excellent.
My name is Lou, and I'll be your token Buddhist for the night. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is a book called Moral Ground that was put together by a woman named Kathleen.
I brought it too.
Aren't we cool? Put together by Kathleen Dean Moore and Michael P. Nelson. Moore is an ethicist at a university out in Oregon, and the book is about climate change, but what I like about this book is that everything she says and that everything that's written in here directly applies to our water situation here in Florida. What they did was they asked a lot of good thinkers all over the world to answer the question, why should we bother to try to save our world? And when they got the answers back, they edited them down. They're in this book. The contributors are people like Wendell Berry, Dalai Lama, Dave Foreman, Thich Nhat Hanh, John Paul II, Bill McKibben, Barack Obama is in there, Gary Snyder, who's one of my all-time favorite poets, is in there, Terry Tempest Williams, E.O. Wilson. There's a whole bunch of people. They got all their essays and they boiled them down and came up with 14 categories of why we should bother to try to save our world, which I translate in, why should we bother to save our water? And what this demonstrates to me is something that the Dalai Lama has talked about, which he calls secular ethics, which is the idea of ethical systems that aren't tied to any one religion, but that can be extremely effective because they're things that most thinking people can agree on. And I just want to read you those 14 categories because I think they're really interesting and I think they have a direct application to our water issues. Her question was, do we have a moral obligation to take action to protect the future of a planet in peril? I would translate that into, do we have a moral obligation to take action to protect our waters? And here are the answers that they got. Yes, for the survival of humankind. Yes, for the sake of the children. Yes, because compassion requires it. Yes, because justice demands it. Yes, because the world is beautiful. Yes, because we love the world. Yes, to honor and celebrate the earth and earth systems. Yes, because our moral integrity requires us to do what is right. Did I skip some? I think that's it. Oh, I did skip some. Yes, for the sake of the earth itself. Yes, for the sake of all forms of life on the planet. Yes, to honor our duties of gratitude and reciprocity. Yes, for the full expression of human virtue. Yes, because all flourishing is mutual. And yes, for the stewardship of God's creation. Other than that one about the stewardship of God's creation, I think you could take all those things and apply it to anybody, no matter what their religion. I come at this work straight out of my Buddhist background. I grew up Presbyterian, and I found my Buddhist teachers late in life, and I basically ran to them because I knew for a long time that was the direction I was headed in. And the head of the Buddhist group that I study with is His Holiness Orgen Trenli Dorji, the 17th Karmapa. This is his book, The Heart is Noble, that I want to talk about. And Heather, can you do the slides for me? You need the clicker. And I'll just tell you next slide. So, next slide. This book came out in 2013, and Karmapa says a lot of the same things that Pope Francis just said in his encyclical. So, Bob, my guy scooped your guy by a couple years.
1891.
And the first thing that he stresses, that Buddhists everywhere stress, is this idea of interdependence. And I love this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist teacher who was actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize many years ago by Martin Luther King Jr. We are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. In Buddhism, everything is interdependent and interconnected with everything else, including our bodies are connected with the earth. And this dovetails really powerfully with what Pope Francis has said. There's a correspondence between the elements in our bodies. The earth is our flesh, the water is our blood, the fire is the heat of our metabolism, the air is the breath, and the space, if you want to consider a fifth element, which we do in Buddhism, is the space between everything, including and up to the space between the atoms and within the atoms that make up our bodies. So there's this idea that we are not separate from the environment. We are not separate from the water. We are not separate from nature. We're all a part of it, which really also dovetails with a lot of the worldviews of the indigenous people all around the world. Next slide, please. Karmapa, just a little bit about him so that you know. He's the young man who made international headlines over New Year's from 1999 to 2000 when he escaped from Tibet when he was 14 years old, and he was the one who planned that whole thing. He escaped because he was not allowed by the communist Chinese in charge to study with the teachers he needed to study with to advance his knowledge of the Buddhist religion. And so he had to come out of Tibet. He got himself out. He's head of the Karma Kagyu lineage. It's one of the four main schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And he was recently here. He just made his third tour of America in April of this year. And he was really concentrating on reaching out to young people. He spoke at some of our most prestigious universities, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, several others. And his messages were very powerful in terms of saving the environment, because he recognizes that the Himalayan region, which is where he's from, is the headwaters of 5 of the major rivers in Asia, and the Himalayan ice caps are melting. So what's going to happen to all those people when those ice caps are gone and those rivers are gone? He has brought his monks and nuns together to discuss these things and to start reforestation in the area. And he really carries a message of strong environmentalism coupled with social justice and women's rights. Those were the 3 things that he spoke about a lot at universities. And these talks are on YouTube. You can watch them. I highly recommend them. They're absolutely amazing. I'm going to go through a little bit of his ideas from chapter 7 in this book, which is called Environmental Protection, Cultivating New Feelings for the Earth. I spoke about Buddhist belief and traditional Tibetan culture dovetail to view nature as sacred nature as the abode of sacred spirits, and that comes from the pre-Buddhist shamanistic tradition that was present in Tibet and was incorporated. Buddhism, wherever it goes, does a wonderful thing and incorporates elements of the cultures that it gets transferred into. And so they adopted a lot of these shamanistic ideas into their beliefs and their practices. He got started very early. He grew up in a nomadic community in Tibet before he was recognized as Karmapa. They didn't know he was Karmapa, but they knew he was somebody important. And a spring in his community was going dry. And so they asked him to plant a tree, even when he was a young child, and say prayers over this spring. And so he did that with the help of his father, and the spring came back. And that was his introduction to a connection with nature. And he talks about this very powerfully. This idea of nature as sacred really contrasts with nature as the thing to be manipulated, which is, to me, very central when we start talking about ethics, because it raises a lot of questions. He's also spoken about the earth as being a living goddess, and about the environment as being the container and the life forms within it, including human beings, as being the contained. So that raises a question: why would the contained want to wreck the container? He moves on from that to this idea of compassion as something that's central to saving the environment. Compassion in Buddhism has a very specific meaning. It's the wish to free beings from suffering. It's not pity. It's the wish to actually take action. It's not focused so much on the horrible situations people go through. It's focused on what we can do to get them out of those situations. And he said probably need the next slide, the single most important factor that will move us to act to protect the world is compassion. Our compassion should extend to both the physical environment and the beings that inhabit it. Probably the next slide, sorry. This really implies action. And many years ago, I was on a Buddhist discussion group on the internet, and there was a lot of debate between, should you just do your meditation practice or should you get involved in social action? And I always leaned toward getting involved in social action, but there were a lot of people who said, oh, just do your practice and everything will be okay. Well, yay, Karmapa, because he is all for the action, and he really is pushing that. Next slide, please. Does the emphasis on compassion mean that we just let intelligence and science go? No. In Buddhism, wisdom and compassion are coupled. And he says, in Buddhism, we speak of wisdom and compassion as necessarily paired. The healthy relationship between them is for compassion to be like a king, with wisdom or intelligence serving as its minister. The king commands, and the minister has to come up with a way to execute those commands. We need to let the heart lead. And in Buddhism, this is your mind. It's not up here, it's here, which I think is very interesting. Next slide, please. He's also said, our current patterns of consumption are not sustainable. We are literally in the midst of an environmental crisis. And I talked about the Himalayan ice caps and his working with his monks and nuns. Next slide, please. I love this quote. We have a unique ability to create and live by moral systems. Right now, we're using up our environment and using it in the most abusive ways possible. We need to wed intelligence to emotions, especially the emotion of compassion. We also need ethics as a guide in applying our intelligence. We can apply our moral systems more widely so that they are fully inclusive. And the next thing I want to talk about, to me that provides a great segue into the problem of water ethics. And I'm drawing on this book, which, next slide please, Water Ethics, a Values Approach to Solving the Water Crisis. The gentleman who wrote this is an anthropologist, and he speaks my language big time. He talks about the difference between water management as a technical task and water governance, and he separates those two, which was really kind of something that I knew intuitively, but I hadn't really put together in that way. Water management is technical with embedded value assumptions. Water governance is all about values. It's not about the technical stuff. So often I've been in water meetings with water managers that get bogged down on whose science is right. Science is a system that was designed to describe the way the world works. It was never intended to make our moral decisions for us. And I think that's where we're falling short in Florida, is we haven't advanced the discussion into the moral and ethical realm effectively enough. We're letting it be dictated by science and by politics. And if we want to save our springs, if we want to save our rivers, we've got to change that. And he defines values as standards or criteria that guide action, judgment, choice, and attribution of causality. He defines ethics as a coherent system of values. He talks about people who have been working on, next slide please, the global water ethic, and he boils that down into 4 points: keeping nature alive, which is ecology, human right to water and sanitation, social justice, responsible use, which I actually heard a speaker at one of the Center for Earth Jurisprudence events talk about a couple of years ago. He was critiquing environmentalists' messages, and he said, what you really need to be talking about is responsible land stewardship. So I think one of the things we need to be talking about is responsible water stewardship, and he's also big on participatory water governance. I think number one, for nature, we can read Rivers and Springs, Keeping Rivers and Springs Alive. For number two, this applies to the Floridan aquifer, the human right to water and sanitation. If you look at the long-term trends of our aquifer, they're all down. I heard from one person about 1 foot per decade. That doesn't sound like a whole lot until you realize that the layer of fresh water where we get our water, drinking water from, and that feeds our springs, is on top of a layer of salt water. And for every foot that layer of fresh water drops, the layer of salt water underneath rises 40 feet. We already have saltwater intrusions that's happened in the irrigation wells over in Hastings, which is an inland community. So if we keep on with these long-term trends, and you have to be careful when you ask this question of our state's water managers, because if you say, what's going on with our aquifer, they'll say, oh, it goes up and down all the time. That's true, but what you have to ask them is, what are the long-term trends in the aquifer? And it's down. And we need to be very concerned about that. Our farmers need to be very concerned about that, because if we start getting salt water in our wells, they're going to be in as much hurt as we are. So that's a place, I think, where we can make some alliances, which I would love to see us make with farmers. I think we've been really good as water advocates in defining the problems. I think we failed miserably in trying to reach out and make connections with people who have been farming in Florida for generations, who care about our springs as much as we do. And I think we really need to try to build some bridges there, because we have some common interests with water supply. For number 4, the global water ethic that he talks about in this book says that participatory water governance should extend to the lowest appropriate level, which means including all stakeholders, local communities, women, indigenous peoples, possibly even the waters themselves, which gets into the rights of nature movement. What we have here in Florida is stakeholder involvement, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's stakeholder involvement for show. There are stakeholder groups, but I've sat in meetings where the stakeholders have asked pointed questions of the water managers and have received silence or been brushed off. So I think there are legal requirements for those stakeholder groups, but I don't know that the stakeholder groups are being taken seriously. Next slide, please. And then he talks about something that's very interesting, which to me gets at the whole heart of this. He talks about how to move from global ethics to operational ethics. And he talks about the importance of water balance or water budget as the frame within which water management takes place. Our water budget, I strongly suspect, is overdrawn. So I think we're taking more out of the aquifer than rainfall is putting back in, especially in this area of the state, and that got my attention. Next slide, please. He talked about 5 strategies to transform our water ethics, and this really gets into some how-to stuff. Broaden water governance, reframe water education, apply new types of water knowledge, create new water experiences, and analyze water ethics. To broaden water governance, he says, I love this quote, "When water decisions are made by the powerful elite, they will rarely reflect the needs of society as a whole, not to mention the future generations. How will nature be represented in this governance?" He also says voluntary river and watershed associations, like the Itchitucknee Alliance and our Santa Fe River, rely ultimately on being able to mobilize the ethics of local stakeholders. We are nothing without your voice and your support. In terms of reframing water education, he talks about how demonstrating ethical principles that are already influencing water decisions, understanding how those ethics are functioning, analyzing how ethics might be applied to solve problems. Applying new water knowledge, he's big on a holistic approach to water governance that includes the insights of disciplines other than hydrology, economics, engineering, biology, and law. I keep forgetting to say next slide. I think we're about 2 behind. We're on create new water experiences. In his experience, people who bonded with his river, which happens to be the Santa Fe River in New Mexico, people who bonded with his river via cleanups, etc., didn't really come forward when river matters were considered by local governments. They were not seeing the big picture of water decisions, and they did not see the river as home. He doesn't poo-poo those ideas of recreation, fishing, hikes, cleanups, art, writing, film, music, etc. He just questions their effectiveness. Next slide. This is the most interesting part of the whole thing to me. He thinks that we should be analyzing the ethics that are operational in our water management and water governance decisions. I got this idea from John Moran. If an alien anthropologist were to drop into North Central Florida right now and analyze how we're treating our water, he would not have good things to say. He would say that we don't value clean water. We're using it to carry our pollution away. That we think that water supply is unlimited, and we're not doing what we need to be doing to ensure sustainability for future generations. So the author of the book is asking us to identify the prevailing ethics about water, analyze the values demonstrated by those ethics, evaluate new ethical alternatives, and propose new policies. Next slide, please. And he kind of winds up by saying the real problem is the paradigms that we're using. Water as, which to me brings me back to this idea of water as a thing versus water as sacred, water as having inherent value. The idea of water is infinite versus water is finite. Water for profit today versus water for our children tomorrow. And he says, the message for everyone concerned about water is get involved. And this next is something that I've been saying for a while. So to read this person saying it in a textbook kind of blew my mind. Find your gift. Identify what unique perspective or experience or knowledge you can offer to the water discourse or activities. If you find your gift, if you do something you love, then your work is an expression of love, and you're going to be a lot happier and a lot more effective at what you do. So I tell people, if what you really love to do is cook, find a way to cook for a fundraiser for your local water group. If you want to make a quilt, do that and donate it to your local water group and have them auction it off and raise money. If you love going to meetings and speaking in front of people, please go to the Water Management District meetings and tell them what you think about our waters. And finally, to tie into what this whole panel was about, he offers some specific ideas what members of religious organizations can do. Next slide, or maybe next 2 slides. There we go. Identify implicit values in water discussions and decisions. These are the values that are already being operated on, but that are not voiced. Inject your moral and ethical precepts into those discussions and ask governments and businesses to adopt water policies that comply with your values. This is a call to action to get involved and get others involved. Our rivers and springs can't speak. They need your voices and your best efforts. Thank you.
Lou, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
We were going to have a moderated discussion, but all 4 of us were wordy. And so instead of that, I think we'll go ahead and hand it over to Kathy so that she can take your questions, because I know after all of that, you must have a lot to ask us. So, Kathy, you want?
I got the long one.
Okay, we'll just trade this one
I'm
around.
like so ready. I can lasso people in this summer. I didn't say that into the microphone. Did you notice? Before I ask for questions, I think that everybody in this room knows that we just had a panel of deeply committed, deeply knowledgeable participants, and I cannot thank them enough for the time and preparation that they took to come and talk with us, and the work that they have done throughout their careers. So let's give them a round of applause. Okay, we're going to take a few questions. We're not going to take a lot, but we're going to take a few questions. So I'll find you if you want to raise your hand.
Thanks. I just want to thank you all again for coming. The issue of politics came up in at least half, probably all of the discussion. How do you ask congregations or faith groups to engage local and state politics?
What do you? Does anyone? Should I take it?
I'll take it. You know, there's a separation between church and state in this country, and I can also speak for our nonprofit groups. We're both 501c3 nonprofits. We are allowed as 501c3 nonprofits to talk about policies. We are not allowed to support or oppose individual candidates for public office. But I think what we can say to people is, please give these issues your full attention, educate yourselves about what's going on, and make your own decisions.
I think one thing we know is that the group that we're thinking of as the caring middle does not understand what's happening with water in Florida and nationally. The most important thing, I think, in articulating a water ethic and in seeing the water ethic embraced in Florida would be widespread knowledge about what's happening with water. And once people, this does not come from the top down, it comes from the bottom up. And it will be once a larger group of Floridians sees the ethical ramifications of water and the intergenerational issues that we all talked about, it's only then that they look for elected leaders who represent those values that Lou just talked about. And there are lots of examples of that in our environmental history. The littering example is one of the most obvious. It was only when people changed their littering ethic that we began to see the fines, the regulations, that we began to see the corporations change their packaging and all of those things. So I think it's maybe not asking them to approach politicians. It's more a matter of helping share this information, because once they know, they do care, and that sort of happens organically. Does anyone else?
Real quick, my answer would be you've got to be involved, and you've got to approach politicians. If they don't know how you as a congregation feel, then they're not going to support your feelings. They hear who they listen to by the number of people, the visibility. So by adopting your watershed, being aware of it, that's one reason we were saying you've got to go to meetings in your community, the government, the water body boards. Have somebody on your committee, your church group, somebody showing up to at least express an opinion.
The sectarian group that I'm with has ample, some would say too much ample, precedence for mixing in with politics. So there's no need to have to justify it. I can't remember whether it was Rollheiser or Rohr who talked about the 4 necessary things to be a Catholic. And he said the first is prayer, the second is community, the third is social justice, and the fourth is mellowness of spirit. Well, social justice is what we're talking about today, and I think that's virtually all the justification one would need to get up in front of a congregation. Let me just say one thing that I forgot to mention about Sister Pat. She's going to be coming to Gainesville in a month on October the 8th, and she's going to talk an entire hour about Laudate Si at St. Augustine Parish on October the 8th. There are flyers out on the table. Please pick one on your way out.
Other questions? Yes, sir?
I know that in Fort White, the students are aware of the problems, and they're very good at bringing the students up to date on what's happening. And I'm just wondering if there are other schools that are doing the same thing. Is that our future is in the hands of our young people. And I might add that in the 60s, my well was 38 foot good water. It's now over 100 foot.
Specific to the area in the Springs, I can't say I know of exact programs in this area with high school students, but I do know with my work with coastal restoration projects and the grants and all the federal monies, everything that's identified in shoreline restoration, Gulf restoration has a component in it trying to pull in the school systems to become educated and involved in the program.
When I worked for Florida's Eden, they were involved with the Fort White Partnership Program, which for those of you who don't know, it's a wonderful educational program that takes the students out to Ichetucknee Springs State Park to do service learning projects and to also do assignments. They're given assignments across the whole curriculum, English, math, science, and they go to the park to complete those. It really is a kind of classic example of a successful environmental educational program. that could be replicated statewide. Even schools that are urban schools that don't have a spring nearby probably have a park or something. And we were always hopeful that somebody would jump on that and try to replicate that program. So I'm just putting that idea out into the universe. The person to contact over there is Trini Johansson and Valerie Thomas, and they're doing an absolutely wonderful job.
I think the answer to the question about how systematic it is that it's not systematic at all, but there are great pockets of environmental education innovation, Fort White being a great one. There's a lot going on in the Everglades. I meet college students a lot who say, oh my gosh, my whole life changed because of this environmental, a teacher they had in high school just changed their direction. Someone just told me that today. And so I was devastated to hear that there are 10,000 Catholic students and one expressed interest in water issues. So I think there are, great pockets of inspiration, and Gainesville has some. Fort White, you hear about them, but it's not systematic by any means. In fact, there was recently, we had federal funding for environmental education in all states that has recently been cut altogether. We had these offices for environmental education in state capitals that are no longer, that were coordinating some of this. So this too, falls to local communities and what we can do.
Thank you so much. I'm really intrigued. A number of you mentioned the idea of changing the paradigm, and I've been doing a lot of thinking around that lately, around language choice. Wes Jackson, in the latest Land Institute journal, just was talking about we need to be talking about the ecosphere, and when we change our language, we change our neurology. So if we're going to change the paradigm, if we're going to incorporate ethics, what all are you folks looking at the language you use and how we can change language to create this new paradigm of an ethical approach to things? Like the word environment speaks to the setting. It's environment versus the farmer, environment versus business, whatever. Whereas if we say the ecosystems, the ecosphere, it's all about connectivity. So I'm just curious how you folks are using that in your work.
I want to be using that all the time, and I would invite you, Nancy, to participate with us. As soon as I get approval from the Ichetucknee Alliance Board, I want to call a group of people together to talk about that very thing, because we need to up our game, and we need to up it in a way that is inspiring and that reaches more people. I've done some work on it already, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, and I need help. I need brain power help behind this, so I would love it if you would be willing to get involved.
As the writer on the panel, we'll actually lose a writer as well. As a second writer on the panel, I would say that the reason I like the framework of the water ethic is that it's appealing to a broad swath of people, and I think words like ecosphere are not appealing. I think that, did someone say creation? Yeah, creation as a more appealing word. I think that's a good word. I think there are, like you said, environment. Unfortunately, some of these E words are not appealing or carry baggage from past times and past stridents. And so I think Lou has a really wonderful idea to brainstorm some different sorts of language that we can use.
Maybe just slightly off track in some ways, but having, in the past months just gotten a certification you probably don't know with DEP, or no, Federal Environmental Protection Agency, on blue credits. And the whole realm coming together with blue credits, and industry isn't going to buy into what we want anyway. They're already in a mentality of make money. But fortunately, California's led the way. And right now, if you want to do some wetland restoration, you could get funds from California so they can get their blue credits. So until we as a state also start giving the corporate end their little bonus on the side for doing blue projects, you know, we're kind of, I don't know if we have a battle to win against them, or the terminology will make a difference. But the blue credits, just like green credits, carbon credits, are very important. The best place to sequester carbon is in the marshes. So if you can create a marsh, you can sell it to California and they'll buy it.
I'm not sure if I can really speak to wording, but I think I can speak to ideas. I spent perhaps the last 10 or 15 years of my career, not entirely, but dealing with the relationship between science and religion. And one of the major, I think, revolutions or evolution that needs to come about is that science thus far for the past 300 years has revolved about objects moving according to laws, a very mechanical way of the world, and that works fine for our physical environment. The problem is it doesn't translate very well into living systems whatsoever, because living systems are not simply objects, they are processes, they are networks of processes, which I spent almost my entire career working with, was ecosystem networks and analyzing them. And I just came back from a conference in California called Seizing an Alternative, and the idea is that this isn't just a matter between science and religion, it's a matter between society and law and politics, to transfer our thinking from mechanism to process. And I think it's an extremely, extremely important transition to make.
In the interest of honoring everybody's time, since we went late today, I'm going to end the questions there. I will tell you our panelists have agreed to stay for a short time, and if there's something else that you'd like to discuss with them, we'd be more than happy to have you do so. Like they agreed to stay just now. Did you catch that? Anyway, I do appreciate everybody being here. All of the sponsors appreciate your time, your attendance, and your support of everything that everybody is trying to do. Stay tuned for the next announcement for Water Voices, and do stay after if you'd like to have some more conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.